Greetings! Shah here, and today we are tackling everything Guardian Druid. Yes, you heard me, everything Guardian Druid for patch 9.2. We're talking secondary stats, talents, covenants, legendaries, soulbinds, conduits, best in slot gear, etc. Creating a full guide and class breakdown can and will be a ton of information, so buckle up. For those who are looking for specific topics, or for anyone who needs to backtrack at any point, there will be timestamps below for your convenience. Quick disclaimer, this guide is based on information that has been available on the PTR at the time of patch announcement. Certain things are subject to change, so this video is more of a general guideline to class and spec for patch 9.2. For changes over the course of the patch, I recommend joining my Discord, where I will discuss changes and also have tertiary sources available and easily accessible, sources like Subcreation, Wowhead, Blood Mallet, etc. The link for that will be in the description below. With that out of the way, let's get into it. This guide, similar to past guides, will be broken up into different sections. Due to covenants and double legendaries, there is a ton of complexity that has been added since the start of Shadowlands. While I was banging my head against the script, I figured it would be best to talk about everything that I would consider generic first. So these would include topics like stat weights, gear, enchants, legendaries, and basic talent structure that can be applied to any character regardless of your covenant choice. Once we cover all this, I will then get into each covenant respectively, going over double legendaries, soulbinds, talent changes, and conduits, of course. So let's start with stat weights. This is going to be pretty straightforward. Agility will always be king, especially with the added tier sets. Agility increases the general strength of our abilities, adds attack power, and dodge, which is crucial to a Guardian Druid's ability to mitigate, heal, survive, all while dealing damage and maintaining threat. While agility is cool, there are a few things you need to keep in mind when it comes to secondary stats. Haste is going to be important, but only to a certain value. We call this a breakpoint. While in the past low haste builds were common, this is no longer the case due to the strength of Thrash this expansion. Achieving a certain level of haste allows the player to cast Thrash one global sooner than normal, which means more healing, more absorption, and of course, more damage. This value is going to be somewhere around the 18% mark. You can go a little higher or lower depending on your group composition, but this is generally a good number to target. I will get into gear soon, but generally speaking, rings and neck slots are going to be the strongest contributor to making sure you hit these haste breakpoints. Following haste, high levels of verse will be your ultimate goal. While mastery and crit have their place, verse is just an extremely overpowered tank stat. With the new scaling on gear, you're going to be aiming to hit about 30%. The reason for 30% is because this is the value that stats begin to have a diminishing return. In a general sense, this means that each point of versatility beyond 30% is worth 10% less and will continue to decrease as you get higher. Players can choose to continue stacking verse after 30% if they think that the 10% reduction value is still going to be higher than other stats. But the new tier set will be scaling off of attack power, which adds a pretty big value to the Guardian Druid's mastery, which increases their healing received, max health, and attack power. So mastery can end up actually being a pretty solid stat. Crit this time around will most likely be ignored due to the lack of interaction between critical strikes and survivability. In the past, Guardian Druids relied pretty heavily on their ability to dodge attacks as a major form of mitigation. The new tier set revolves around more uptime on your major cooldown, Berserker Incarn, and the interaction with Thrash absorbs. The legendary Ursox here, remember, doesn't require the Guardian Druid to dodge as much as they need to absorb incoming damage, especially when it comes to magical damage in a Mythic Plus environment. So, long story short, you can ignore crit for the most part unless you're going for a pure DPS build for Raid. Throughout talking about secondary stance, I've mentioned attack power a few times, but I think now is the best time to explain how it's going to interact with the tier set. Nailed this transition. Cutting straight to the chase, the tier set for Guardian is great because it addresses the core issue of the class, which is threat generation. When it comes to Raid, it allows you to deal more damage while being in bear form, though weaving in and out of cat or moonkin form will still be universally encouraged when looking to optimize damage. In keys, having more on-demand initial threat will be extremely beneficial, so let's quickly explore how this tier set will interact with the class. The 2-set bonus, Architect's Design, reads, casting Barkskin will cause you to berserk for 4 seconds. I will quickly add that if you're talented into Incarnation, it's going to replace Berserk. This is going to be giving you the ability to spam Thrash for more damage, threat, and faster stacks of Rend and Tear, which is a talent choice. This will also give you cooldown reduction on your already spent Frenzied Regeneration stacks. Despite the simplicity of the mechanic of the tier set, overall I think this is a very cool and interactive 2-set bonus. The 4-set is slightly more passive but adds a pretty massive buff to your major cooldown, Berserker Incarnation. This was nerfed a few days ago with the patch announcement, but still remains to be pretty powerful. Architect Aligner, which is the 4-set bonus, reads, while berserked, you radiate for 26.6% attack power in cosmic damage, and you're going to heal yourself for 39.7% attack power every 1 second. Since the 2-set is giving you Berserk or Incarnation, this 4-set interacts quite nicely, having small bursts of damage and healing during that short Barkskin window, and then the interaction with your actual cooldown just adds flat damage and won't really interact much with anything else. It'll just be nice to have a pretty big boost of damage and more numbers to flood your screen. The reason I was mentioning that Mastery may be more powerful secondary stat is because the tier set will be stronger based on your attack power, which comes from both Agility and the Guardian Druid's Mastery. I think this is better than purely scaling off of Verse like a lot of tertiary abilities do in World of Warcraft, because this adds a third valuable secondary stat for Guardian Druid, which I am extremely excited for. I've always enjoyed messing around with big ticket items like trinkets, rings, and necklaces, while also adjusting enchants to increase my performance in a certain setting. All I can say is that I'm looking forward to this tier set bonus, and obtaining the 4-set should be on everyone's priority list. Piggybacking off of the topic of tier sets, let's quickly address gear. The new tier items are going to drop from the new raid as well as your Mythic Vault. On top of this, you can spend time doing the new Zone Zereth Mortis to be able to transmute items into tier set pieces in future weeks, probably around the 8th week of the tier. This adds as a bad luck protection to players like me who are extremely unlucky when it comes to valuable items dropping. Because of this, it will be extremely easy to target your set bonus whether you raid or not. I think that it's also important to note that the 2 more valuable tier set items are actually going to be coming from the last bosses of the raid. These are going to be chest and shoulders. These drops from the Lord of Dread and Rygalon, who won't be accessible till the 2nd week of the raid tier. The reason that these are so valuable is because they're simply a higher item level than all of the other items in the raid or from Mythic Plus. As I've said before, item level is going to be king simply due to agility and the increased raw value of the secondary stat on those items. After this, we will see tier sets drop from Lithium? Lithium. Sure, we'll go with that. Halandris and Anduin. For those who have a keen eye to detail, you'll notice that tier items don't drop until the middle of the tier, so it may take some work to obtain these. Hopefully you have a good raiding guild. Lihuvim and Anduin will be the preferred tier set items. The reason for this is that the stats are going to be a little bit better for your secondary stat priority. On top of this, it's common for legs to be an option for the legendary item Ursox Fury Remembered. And since legendary items are a higher item level than your average raid item, you'll make sure you want to leave this slot untouched because a 291 legendary will just have more raw stats on it. The only other item I want to touch on are trinkets, and we will definitely be seeing players use the blood splattered scale again despite the recent nerf. This drops from the other side, and ideally you'll want to see one in your vault early season, but don't wait for luck to happen, so I highly recommend farming the other side dungeon for a shot at the trinket. Regardless of the item level, it'll still pack a punch and allow you access to an additional defensive. Until the raid can be cleared regularly, I would advise continuing to run your reactive defense matrix or Shard of Van Hild from Sanctum of Domination until you can get your hands on a pocket protoforge from Lithium again. There's another trinket that has piqued my interest, and that would be the Elegy of the Eternals from the Prototype Pantheon. The reason for this is because it's an insane amount of verse on a 5-minute cooldown, so it can have some cool interactions with Heart of the Wild, but yet to be tested. Tazavesh contains Codex of the First Technique, which acts very similar to Reactive Defense Matrix from Sanctum of Domination. Since the trinket will now be available to upgrade with Valor, this is a trinket I would keep an eye out for since it offers an offensive and defensive value. Outside of that, you can always run some of the classic dungeon trinkets like File of Putrefaction, Flayed Wing Toxin for a little extra damage, though I highly recommend getting your hands on some of the new raid trinkets. Getting gear isn't all that you can do to make yourself as strong as possible. Making sure you enchant your gear will give you that extra little edge. So the enchants you're going to want to get are going to be eternal stats for your chest. For your cloak, you can either use Fortified Leech in dungeons, and you can use Fortified Avoidance in the raid. Rings, it really comes down to what your stat distribution is going to look like. I would recommend Haste Reverse, or you can always go into crit if you're looking for a little extra damage. For your feet, of course, you're going to want to make sure you enchant this with agility, and then your weapon, you have options. You can run Sinful Revelation if you'd like, but I would always recommend Celestial Guidance for raid, and in lower keys when you're doing some type of AoE farm, Lightless Force is always really fun, but Celestial Guidance is typically the go-to. Alright, so let's quickly talk about legendaries. Legendaries allow the player to significantly improve one of their item slots with the stats that they need or want on a higher item level piece of gear and get access to a unique effect which bolsters either power, survivability, or utility. In Raid, there are a ton of legendaries that I recommend, and a lot of cool different combinations depending on the encounter, composition, playstyle, and of course your covenant. I'm going to move through this pretty quickly since I don't want this video to be 45 minutes long like it has been in the past. So Natural Order's Will still remain one of the best all-around defensive tank legendaries for Guardian Druid in the raid setting. New players to Guardian Druid should aim for this legendary until they feel comfortable with the class or the encounter. For single target then, Draft of Deep Focus will be the primary go-to legendary for any Covenant you play, especially when you pair it with Feral Affinity. This allows you to get extra damage out of both Moonfire and the Rip and the Rake effect while you're doing Kitty Weaving, which is a pretty significant damage boost. Legacy of the Sleeper then pairs well with the new 2-set bonus, giving you a little extra bonus damage in Leech when you cast Barkskin. This legendary will be great for any kind of multi-target fight where you can't spend a lot of time outside of bear form. Lastly, Oath of the Other Druid legendary could be a possible cool combination for certain encounters with Night Fae players, since you can get some really nice burst windows with Convoke, since both Convoke and now Heart of the Wild proc will be both on a minute. Again, these legendaries are fairly optional and only should be used once you feel comfortable on the class. Guardian Druid in Raid has a pretty high skill ceiling when it comes to doing damage and healing due to the complexity of Owl or Kitty Weaving. In regards to Mythic Plus, there are 2 legendaries I would recommend crafting, and that would be Legacy of the Sleeper and of course Ursox Fury Remembered, with the most important being the latter. I will get more into these once I start talking about specific covenants, but before that, let's briefly discuss a general talent build for Guardian Druids. I'm going to be discussing some of the changes based on your covenant choice later in the video, of course, when I get to each section. For now, we will talk about talents that are more or less lock-ins. I will be jumping between Raid and Mythic Plus for both of the talent rows. Blood Frenzy is an easy lock-in for the first talent row for Mythic Plus. The Rage is just extremely valuable for Guardian Druids, especially because Ironfur can be stacked multiple times, increasing our sturdiness to physical attacks, and more importantly, it gives the Guardian Druid a steady stream of Rage for single target encounters, allowing the Guardian Druid to actually maintain uptime on Ironfur while actively tanking. As for Rage, damage is typically a little bit more predictable and static, so Brambles is a good choice for passive small damage absorb, as well as a little bit of damage during your Barkskin windows, which will now be more frequent because of the tier set. The next talent row honestly is flavor more than anything. If you need mobility, take Wild Charge. If you need a little extra mini defensive, you can snag Renewal. There isn't much to it, and both of these are applicable in both Raid and Mythic Plus. Mythic Plus leans a little bit more into Renewal, and Raid is, again, a choice of flavor. I'm going to leave the third talent row alone for now, since all 3 options really depend on the type of content you're doing as well as your covenant choice. If you're learning to play Guardian Druid for the first time though, I personally recommend talenting into Resto Affinity, since you'll gain a passive heal from this choice, but you will lose out on those damage windows in Raid and occasionally Mythic Plus, but we're going to circle back to this once we talk about covenants. The 35 talent row is another flavor choice. In Mythic Plus, it generally comes down to composition. If you lack a lot of lockdown, things like stuns and of course other forms of CC, then Mighty Bash is going to be a great choice to help your group. Mass Entanglement can be taken in a few different dungeons when adds or patrols need to be kept at bay. And then Heart of the Wild is going to be best on a Night Fae Druid, and sometimes Kyrian, depending. But it can be utilized quite well in a dungeon scene to get just good damage out of certain windows of opportunity. And Heart of the Wild will be a lock-in for raids, and CCs most of the time are useless or unimpactful. The 40 row is pretty simple: Galactic Guardian in Raid and Incarnation in Mythic Plus. Occasionally there is a time and place for Incarnation in Raid, but it's normally if you need an additional cooldown for survivability, but I really don't need to say much more about that. Regarding the 45 talent row, there are a ton of arguments to either pick Survival of the Fittest or Earth Warden. Now, Survival of the Fittest will have an additional impact on the playstyle of Guardian Druid next year due to the interaction of the tier set. Earth Warden will still remain to be extremely strong, but typically only shines in raid fights where most of the tank damage is going to be slow auto attacks. Deciding between the 2 talents normally comes down to fight design and pacing, but I will say that either can be viable. Now in Mythic Plus, this is where the choice becomes extremely interesting, because the tier set is much stronger in dungeons due to the set damage being uncapped and the value of Incarnation. In low-key, Survival of the Fittest will be extremely strong if you can lean more into the damage value of the tier set rather than the defensive value of Earth Warden. Now in a higher key setting, it will get to the point that Earth Warden will significantly outscale the tier set healing, and the cooldown reduction from Barkskin or Survival Instincts just isn't going to keep up. It is possible to determine what that exact level is that Earth Warden will outscale the tier set bonus, but I'm going to leave that for another video. This video is already way too long and there's still covenants to talk about. The last row is really simple. Rend and Tear is going to be a lock-in for both Raid and Mythic Plus. It's possible to argue Pulverize can be strong, but sadly it's just not practical. A flat 6% damage reduction with close to 100% uptime will typically outvalue 35% damage reduction for a short duration. Barkskin, Survival Instincts, and other tertiary abilities like Trinkets or external cooldowns from other players will always be enough for Raid, and typically always be better in Mythic Plus. Alright, I want to approach Covenants from a certain angle because they're kind of tricky. There are some pretty obvious choices when it comes to Raid or Mythic Plus on which Covenants will be better, but ultimately you can play any Covenant you want and be successful if you're looking to achieve AOTC or KSM. I want to preface this that all soulbind trees that I go over are based on statistics from subcreation and should be taken with a grain of salt. I'm going to link Wowhead guides for Guardian Druid down below, so if you're interested or curious on how they're going to affect and interact with your gameplay, you can learn more about it. There is just too much information to try to cover in just this video alone, and with that being said, if you have any suggestions or corrections, please leave them in the comment section below so they can be addressed. I'm going to probably repeat that after every covenant I go through, but with that out of the way, let's dive into it. Kicking it off, Night Fae is easily the most popular choice among the Druid player base, and that doesn't change for Guardian, at least until this patch. Night Fae is extremely fun to play and pretty powerful. Convoke the Spirits gives you either really big damage while weaving, or can act as a powerful defensive cooldown. Going into 9.2 with double legendaries, Convoke will now be 1 minute instead of 2, and it doesn't take rocket surgery to understand that this is a very powerful effect. Tanks can now weave more often in both Raid and in Mythic Plus, or they have option to an additional defensive that they can fill the gaps where, they might feel susceptible to high amounts of damage. This will most likely be the default for raiding in Mythic Plus. It doesn't really depend on any external factors and will most likely yield the highest damage and highest healing value in a Raid atmosphere. For Mythic Plus, it's extremely easy to play around and it doesn't require any coordination from your group. If you're a player who tends to use LFG often, this would probably be the best Covenant choice. I will say that for every Covenant regarding the Soulbind tree, unless you are min-maxing, you can play pretty much any Soulbind you want to a certain degree, but I will be going over what has been preferred by the majority of the players from each Covenant. So, Night Fae players will be looking to play Naya in Raid and Kyrian for Mythic Plus. Now, a lot of the decisions made on which tree to run depends on some particular Soulbind specific options. Now in Naya's tree, it'll have the Guardian Druid just hugging the left-hand side all the way down, with Grove Invigoration and Burrs being those big ticket items. When it comes to conduits, you'll be using the standard Covenant-specific potency along with unchecked aggression for that massive haste window during Berserk. Well-honed Instincts, Innate Resolve, and Toughest Bark are the ideal endurance conduits for Guardian Druid players, and the Finesse Conduit, front of the pack, will always be the standard play in most raid encounters, but I will say that Finesse Conduits are pretty easy to swap around depending on what your group needs or wants. Now, if you're a designated battle res for your raid group, Born Anew is probably also a solid choice, especially if you have a plethora of Windrush totems at your disposal or other druids in your raid. When heading into the depths of a dungeon, you're going to want to swap over to Kyrian. This is mainly due to Wild Hunt tactics and First Strike, which adds massive damage boost at the start of each pull. This tree will find the Guardian Druid once again splitting their conduits in a 3-2-1 fashion. Your 3 endurance conduits will be Well-honed Instincts, Toughest Bark, and Layered Mane. Your double potency will be standard again, including both Conflicts of the Elements and Unchecked Aggression. And your finesse conduit will typically be Born of the Wilds due to the reduced cooldown on Heart of the Wild, bringing it more in line with Convoke as an offensive ability. It'll move the cooldown from 5 minutes to about 4-minute mark. When it comes to talents, Balance Affinity is a pretty popular choice among the Night Fae Guardian Druids, and this is mainly because in Mythic Plus you can find a lot of windows where you can kite mobs while convoking in Moon Conform, allowing you to get off some pretty big damage with Star Surge, Starfall, and Full Moon. Balance Affinity also synergizes with First Strike a little bit from the Kyrian's tree, giving you a higher chance that you will proc the free crit upon pulling, though Moonfire can essentially do the same thing. If you have any suggestions again about this tree, please leave them in the comment section below so people can reference back to them. And again, these things can change over time, and I'm sure several players will appreciate it. Moving on to Kyrian. This Covenant has grown in popularity since 9.15, which has allowed players to freely swap Covenants. With the addition of the Covenant Legendary, we have seen a lot of Guardian Druids make the swap to act as a buff bot for their group. Kindred Spirits is a pretty unique interaction. It allows you to absorb incoming damage from your bonded player, and it either duplicates damage or healing that your partner does. So while Kindred Spirits by itself is pretty lackluster, the double legendary effect is actually my favorite out of all 4 of the Covenant legendaries. Essentially, depending on whatever covenant your partner is, it'll give you both the secondary stat based on that covenant choice. So if your partner is Venthyr, it's going to give you both crit. If they're Kyrian, it gives mastery. If they're Night Fae, it gives haste. And Necrolord, it gives verse. This value has been nerfed pretty drastically in recent weeks leading up to 9.2 announcement, but it's still expected to be pretty valuable in the dungeon scene. Due to the base effect of Kindred Spirits, it can be really effective in tight coordinated groups. The soulbind option is pretty easy. It's Papa Mykonos. He's going to be the best choice due to the cooldown reduction of Kindred Spirits and the added damage value you get from Effusive Anima Accelerator. Your tree for raid will look a little something like this. Your potencies, like all covenants, will want this covenant-specific potency conduit along with unchecked aggression. You'll also be grabbing your standard triple endurance, which includes well-honed instincts, innate resolve, and tough as bark. And lastly, you'll grab front of the pack for finesse since it brings the value for the raid group, but once again, finesse conduits are more of a preference. When heading into a dungeon, you're going to want to go back to your tree, swap out innate resolve for layered main, and your finesse conduit should be Born of the Wild instead of the front of the pack to get that cooldown reduction in your 30 talent row, whether it's Heart of the Wild or Mighty Bash or Mass Entanglement. Once again, the damage from Accelerator and how often you can hit Kindred Spirits in a key is actually insane due to the conduit and the Accelerator for Mykonos giving you cooldown reduction and big damage. A lot of players still opt into Balance Affinity for the increased spell and attack range, but if weaving is something that you're not interested in or comfortable with, Restoration Affinity is always a strong choice for Mythic Plus. Feral Affinity will have a slightly higher damage yield in Raid, but it's really a preference. Like I mentioned in the Night Fae section, if you have suggestions about this affinity or soulbind tree, please leave them down below in the comment section. The Venthyr legendary was nerfed a long time ago in the early stages of the PTR for patch 9.2, and while this was mostly to keep balanced druids in check, it still negatively affected the possible of really insane damage on the Guardian Druid during that incarnation window. Nonetheless, it's still a pretty solid option. The legendary essentially will extend the length of your Ravenous Frenzy, which is a stacking damage, healing, and secondary stat buff. The more things you can cast within that window means the more damage you'll do. It's an enjoyable little mini game you can play. The legendary will extend the effect by 0.1 second per cast, and this will linger for 3 seconds once the debuff expires, which increases the damage you deal pretty significantly by the end of your incarnation window. To get the value out of this legendary though, and the Covenant, it requires a lot of mass pulling in dungeons, which takes a little bit of coordination in your group. Without Lust or Power Infusion, on the average Guardian Druid should be able to hit about 26 to 27 seconds of uptime on this ability, which is almost a 25% damage buff to Ravenous Frenzy, but the math gets a little tricky there. Sadly, this Covenant is really weak in raids. Luckily, it's very easy to swap Covenants now, so you should be looking to be well practiced in Night Fae or Kyrian. But for any reason you do decide to play Venthyr, the soulbind for this tree is going to be Draven for Mythic Plus, who is a little bit more towards the survivability side of things. Service and Stone and Battlefield Presence are both extremely powerful traits on this tree, and you'll be looking to take 4 Endurance Conduits and 2 Potencies instead of the standard 3-2-1. You'll be able to run Well-Honed Instincts, Layered Main, and Tough as Bark for Mythic Plus, and because of that extra Endurance slot, you can throw in Condensed Animosphere, which is a pretty good source of healing, and it scales with your mastery. For the Potency, once again, you'll grab Unchecked Aggression and Endless Thirst. There is an option to swap the Soulbind trait to Built for War instead of Superior Tactics, which will drop an Endurance to pick up a Finesse Conduit if you'd like to, but again, it's up to you. There is the possibility of Nagia becoming a popular choice for Mythic Plus specifically, but this is dependent on scaling, and if that shift happens, I will definitely be talking about it more. For Raid though, Nagia is the strongest option because it has a slightly better damage yield, but Draven still seems to be the stronger choice. Now, up until this point, we've actually seen a pretty even 3-way split for the Soulbinds, so for the sake of it, we're going to just stick to Draven. The big change you'll see is the shift from Superior Tactics, the Soulbind trait, to Built for War, which has you pick up a Finesse Conduit by dropping an Endurance. So you're going to want to trade out your Layered Main for a Finesse Conduit, and then your Condensed Animosphere you can trade out for Innate Resolve like you see on screen. Like I've said at the end of the last 2 sections, if you have any changes or suggestions, leave them in the comments below. Thanks, homies. And last but not least, Necrolord, up to this point, has been declining in popularity and for some pretty obvious reasons. The other 3 Covenants tend to shine in 3 very unique different instances, and Necrolord seems to be extremely lackluster in comparison. It doesn't offer as much single target as Night Fae, or the group utility like Kyrian, or the AoE damage like Venthyr. Going into patch 9.2, the legendary power on top of all of this for Necrolord does almost nothing to address it. It's extremely underwhelming and it's giving your Adaptive Swarm a 60% chance to split, and sadly, I think it needs a rework and won't be represented all that much at the top end of the ladder in Mythic Plus or in Raid, but let's quickly talk about it for all of those diehard Necro boys out there. For Raid, it seems to be MNI for the damage element, but it's about multiple thousands of DPS behind Night Fae. The tree will look fairly similar to Night Fae and Kyrian, mainly being that typical 3-2-1 split. The lock-ins are going to be your two potencies, being Unchecked Aggression and Evolved Swarm. Your Endurance conduits, once again, are going to be Well-Honed Instincts, Tough as Bark, and Innate Resolve. And of course, the Finesse conduit, again, is completely up to you, but Front of the Pack or Born in the Wild seems to be the more popular choices. In Mythic Plus, it seems like an overwhelming majority of Guardian players do run Plague Deviser Merilith. This is the first time we're going to see a Guardian tree actually build a triple potency with Unchecked Aggression, Evolved Swarm, and also Adaptive Armor Fragment, which will give you a pretty solid DPS increase whenever you're healed by another player. As for the Endurance conduits, we are seeing the same as we've seen before in other Covenants, which is Well-Honed Instinct, Layered Main, and Tough as Bark. While this tree does lean hard into the triple potency, it does have one of the more tankier soulbind traits that give you and your group a little bit of absorption shields. For the last time as well, if you have any recommendations or suggestions about this tree, please leave them below. If anything drastic changes as the season gets underway, I'm sure I'm going to get around to covering it or updating this video. Jesus, fuck, that was a long video. If somehow you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. I really hope it helped. There was a ton of information here, so if you still have questions or missed something, please let me know down below in the comment section. I'll do my best to try to answer it. Please be polite and respectful down there. I will also leave some links to Wowhead and sub creation for reference in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to hit that like button and subscribe button. If you downvote it, doesn't matter because no one will know. I'm also leaving my Discord and Twitch links down below as well. Starting in 9.2, I fully expect to be continuing to pushing out Mythic Plus guides as the season progresses, and I'm hoping to stream some of my pushing as well. Again, thank you so much for watching. I hope you're all staying happy, healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Take care.